So this is the next lecture on Gramsci's Intellectuals, and we have more or less covered much of the ideas that Gramsci has discussed in this essay, The Formation of the Intellectuals. Today we are going to focus on one particular aspect. By this time you should have a fair idea of who are the organic intellectuals based on the previous classes, that is. You also know who the traditional intellectuals are, right? And what is the relationship between organic and traditional intellectuals. So today we will take one of the central ideas from Gramsci's essay, and we will discuss. We'll obviously continue from where we left, but we are going to have this particular quote from Gramsci at the center of today's discussion. And the quote goes, "All men are intellectuals, but not all men have in society the function of intellectuals." So Gramsci says that all men are intellectuals. Now this is an oldish language, so all men meaning all humanity, of course. It doesn't mean only man. I hope not. So all of humanity, everyone, are intellectuals, but all of them do not have the social function of intellectuals. Now you remember one of the early classes on Gramsci, I began with a quote from Marx, and then I showed you how that quotation leads to the formation of the emancipatory intellectual, to which tradition Gramsci belongs. Now today we are going to do something similar. We are going to discuss Gramsci's essay in light of one of his central ideas, right? And we are going to understand what this idea is all about, right? What he says when he means that everyone, all human beings are intellectuals, but all human beings do not have the social function of intellectuals. So now obviously one of the central words in this quotation is intellectuals, and when it comes to the word intellectuals, you already have a fair idea of what Gramsci means when he uses the term intellectuals. You already know who are organic intellectuals, and you also know that organic intellectuals are those who are formed from within their class or within their community, right? Intellectuals who are usually committed to their own class, but obviously it is also possible for intellectuals to develop commitments towards other social classes. So yeah, we already know who intellectuals are, but today we will look at what he means by the function of the intellectual. Now to be fair, we have already discussed this too a bit, that is the function of an intellectual, and again I will just give you a recap so that you can relate what discussions we have had pertaining to the function of intellectuals. Now you also remember, you must remember that is, that I had mentioned intellectuals as being usually committed to their own social class. In relation to that, it was also mentioned that the dominant classes, they have formed institutions where they have planted or placed their own intellectuals to further their own cause, to further their interests, to protect their interests in society, right? Now that is where you have to pick a clue from, right? Because we also know that there are intellectuals among farmers, there are intellectuals among carpenters, right? Just so you can take any example, anyone in the working class, and you can easily argue, well, it's not much of an argument, it's a fact that there are intellectuals in or among all classes. But this is where the question comes: do those people, does the carpenter who is an expert in the field of carpentry, or is the farmer who is truly an expert in the field of agriculture, who knows what the weather will be like next year, or I don't know, next year maybe, that's just something I said, but I hope you are able to understand. Intellectual in the sense that he is truly an expert in his area, in this case agriculture, and he will be consulted by other farmers, right? So anyone in the working class is also an intellectual. But this is where Gramsci's quotation becomes interesting, that all men may be intellectuals, they are intellectuals, but not all men have the function of intellectuals in society. So let's move on. Just keep in mind that today's discussion will be done with this quotation at the center, right? This is the locus of today's discussion. All right, so I'll just give you one quick recap from something I had mentioned in the previous class. because we are going to pick up from there, and today's lecture is going to be a continuation from where we left off. So intellectuals of the dominant classes, like I just mentioned, are able to establish their views of life, their views of society, of culture as universal, right? They are able to conceal their class bias through the pretensions of social science. Now we gave the example of economics, right? They are also able to establish categories and concepts that appear pure rather than congealed in the interests of the dominant classes. So I am projecting my interests into everyone else. If, let's say, I belong to the dominant classes, I am an intellectual who not only defends the dominant classes, but also tries to further the cause or protect the interests of the dominant classes. Now, so what have I done? I have created a branch of study, right, just to protect those interests. And after creating that branch of study, that could be economics, that could be law, that could also be literature. And as you progress further ahead in your studies in literature, you will realize that literature is also one of the ways in which dominant classes do protect their interests. We will look into that later, but that's why we are reading Gramsci in the first place, right? To find out how the relationships or how the power dynamics that are portrayed by Gramsci are present in actual literature. That's the larger aim, right? If you were to ask me today, sir, why are we reading Gramsci? Well, obvious the answer is it's there in your syllabus, but the more nuanced, critical answer would be that we are reading Gramsci to understand certain power dynamics in society, and we will use that knowledge, that understanding of the power dynamics to study literature. All right, we will be able to see those power dynamics at play in novels, in epics, in poems, everywhere, right? So that's the larger aim. That's why it's there in your literature syllabus. So with that in mind, let's get back to what I was saying. So the dominant classes are able to conceal their class bias through the pretensions of all of these things, like economics or literature or sociology. Now remember, again, do not look at any of these through moralistic lens. Do not say that just because there is economics being taught in your college or economics being taught at universities everywhere doesn't mean that it's a bad thing, right? What I'm trying to say, or what Gramsci is trying to say, is that economics is being used in a certain way by the dominant classes. It doesn't mean that any subjects in the social sciences, whether it's sociology or economics or political science or even literature, is not inherently bad, right? It's not inherently villainous, right? Please note that. That's a very important point. There is no morality here. There may be morality, but do not moralize when you study it, right? That's where we should begin. Now, the dominant classes and their intellectuals, who are placed in all kinds of institutions, beginning from colleges and schools and medical institutions and legal institutions and everywhere, political institutions and so on and so forth, they try to establish their views of life as neutral, natural, universal, right? Now, obviously, you're smart enough to interpret some of the possible examples on your own. I'm not going to give you very specific examples, but I think it's quite obvious that if someone is in the dominant class, or someone belongs to any class for that matter, he or she would use his or her life as a yardstick to measure everything else. Isn't that true? Right? So that's what is happening here. The dominant classes, since they are in control of all social institutions, they are able to establish their views of life as universal and neutral, while in reality it may not be neutral. So think of a class of people. I said I wouldn't be giving you any specific examples, and I will be giving you an example, but it will not be specific. It will not be a very pointed example. That's what I mean. So imagine a class of people who are quite wealthy, right? All of whom have cars, or all of whom have all kinds of fancy gadgets and so on and so forth, right? So they have a very lavish lifestyle. This is in this example, right? So to these people, it may be difficult to believe that there is a life outside that, right? So when faced with that fact, that fact that life also exists outside how their life is may be a challenging fact to face, right? So naturally, they try to establish their views as neutral and universal. I hope the point was made. Please ask me questions if this point isn't clear to you. All right. Now we will look at, once again, not a pointed example, pointed in the sense that we are not picking people, we are not picking Bezos and Ambani. In that way, it's not pointed, but we are taking an example in principle, right? Something that exists in society, that concerns everyone in society, if not just exists, right? So in mainstream economics, again we're going back to economics, and the reason is all of the writing that Gramsci does has its foundations in economics, right? He's not giving you economic theories, he's not giving you theories of demand and supply, right? He's not telling you what ideal prices should be. In that way, he's not an economist, but you have to understand that economics is the base, right, of what he is writing. He understands that everything is society is based on that base. All right. So again, slight detour. The reason that I keep mentioning economics, and the reason why I also say that Gramsci's ideas are founded on economics, is an age-old theory in age-old theory which was first established by Karl Marx. Now again, Marx, like I mentioned in the early classes, is one of the intellectual forerunners of Gramsci, right? Gramsci is greatly inspired by his ideas, and he, furthers Marxist thought. All right. So Marx famously said that economics is the base of the society, culture is the superstructure, right? So, base refers to the foundation, and Marx had used a very architectural metaphor. I hope obviously all of you know what a metaphor is, right? So Marx, in his example, in his metaphor, he said that imagine a house, and the base of that house, the foundation of that house, the things that you cannot see above ground, right? The poles or all the work that has gone underground, right? That is the base of the house or the foundation. Now everything else that is visible from outside is called the superstructure. Now these are originally German terms. In English, they are translated as base and superstructure, right? So economics is the base of society, and Gramsci continues to belong to that tradition of thought where he considers economics as the base of the society, and all other aspects of culture, whether it's human relationships, whether it's education, whether it's politics, everything has an outcome of the base, which is economics. Hence, we keep repeating economics. But remember, here we are not studying economics in the sense that we are not here to, understand the relationship between demand and supply, or to understand and learn how to use graphs in economics. We are not doing that, right? We are trying to understand cultural theory, and we need to refer to economics because in this system of thought, in the Gramscian or Marxist system of thought, economics is considered to be the base of everything else. All right. If economics is okay, everything else will be okay. It's like that, right? So yeah. So in mainstream economics, scarcity is a core concept, right? A core concept in the sense that it shapes everything else in the stream of economics. Now, if scarcity is a core concept, is a fundamental concept, naturally intellectuals ask the next question. What is this next question? And the next question is, if there is scarcity of goods, of any good for that matter, how are we going to distribute it? What is the best way to distribute so that more and more people get it? Now, their answer, the answer given by the intellectuals of the dominant class, is the market. Now, go back to the previous slide, or what I was mentioning a few minutes ago, that the dominant classes or the intellectuals of the dominant class, they often try to project their view of life or their solutions, what solutions they provide as neutral solutions, right? Now, take the example of the market. If you ask an economist, if you ask not all economists, of course, uh, economists who align themselves or commit to the cause of the dominant class. I'm talking about those economists. Please do not apply to, like, don't find the closest economist and ask him why are you in support of the market. Don't do that. That would be a very foolish approach. All right. So now these economists who align with the dominant classes, they will say that the market is the best way to solve the problem of scarcity, right? Or if not solve the problem, to address the problem of scarcity. So then the question is market a neutral term, or is market a neutral thing in the first place? Now remember, there are two classes of intellectuals, at least two classes of intellectuals. So the dominant classes will tell you that, well, there is scarcity and I also have a solution to the scarcity. What is that? Market. There will be a market, people will go there to sell, people will go there to buy. So their prices will automatically determine themselves. I hope you have read some economics, right? How prices are determined and all of that. I'm not going into much detail, but this is the kind of theory, or this is the kind of proposal the intellectuals of the dominant classes come up with, that the market is the best way to address the problem of scarcity. Now there are also intellectuals from the peasantry. These are people who are either directly belong to the working classes, who are born and brought up within the working classes, or those who have committed their intellect in support of the working classes, right? Now these intellectuals will point out that the term market is not neutral at all, but rather the term market, or the concept of the market, is actually shaped by social structure. By whom? By those who are powerful enough to define the market. Now this is very, very important, because here an interesting point is coming up, which is, if you have the power to define something, and if you have the power to make that definition acceptable by a lot of people, right, then you are in control of large portions of society. I hope you are able to follow, right? Now go back to this dynamic between the working classes and the working class intellectual and the intellectual who is protecting the interest of the dominant class. So basically dominant class versus working class, if you see it in that versus dynamic, right? I do not usually encourage you to see it this way, but in this specific example of the market, let's see it as a collision. All right. So what is the dominant market, dominant intellectual telling you? Intellectual from the dominant class, he or she is telling you that scarcity exists and the solution to which is the market. What will the working class intellectual tell you? He or she will tell you that market itself is not neutral, but it is controlled by people who have the power to define what market is. So it is the dominant classes who are determining what market is, how it should function, and so on, right? And this is something the dominant classes will not be able to portray. This is something which will only be visible to the working class intellectual, right? Now continuing with this example of market and scarcity, let's look at how choice becomes a factor, right? And this choice can be seen in very broad ways. It can also be seen in very narrow ways, right? Here we are going to take a broad overview. All right. So market choices mean, for instance, that those who are hungry, again we are taking the example of the scarcity, right? Those who are hungry but have no money should not be permitted to eat. So okay, going back to the previous slide, the dominant class intellectual has told you. Now imagine yourself as someone who is a recipient of what the intellectual is telling you. Imagine yourself as being passive to what information is being fed to you. So what information has been fed to you by the dominant class intellectual? By, maybe through your university, through books that you read, through TV series that you watch, through songs that you listen to. It may be through any means, right? So it will be fed to you, that the idea will be fed to you that those who are hungry can eat only if they have money, right? That's very much the concept of the market, right? A market is a place where products are available, but it doesn't mean that anyone who is hungry can go in a market and pick up rice and eat, right? It means that there is rice, someone who has money can go there and then buy it, right? Now markets, the mainstream economists or the dominant class intellectuals will argue, set prices, and prices are the best way to allocate resources. All right. So again, going back to demand and supply, we are obviously not going into complex economics here, but what intellectuals of the dominant classes will tell you, or mainstream economists will tell you, is that a market is a way where, by way of interaction between buyers and sellers, prices will be determined. And as prices are determined, resources will be allocated accordingly, right? Now, you can go back to what economics you have studied in class 11 and 12. I am not going to explain those concepts to you, but I hope if you remember some of the ideas that you have studied in economics before, or even maybe you have economics as in your general courses, you do have idea as to how prices are set in a market, right? How prices are decided from the interaction between buyers and sellers. So I'm not going into that. Please find it for yourselves if you do not know, right? Now, this fact or this idea that market is a place where buyers and sellers will go and prices will determine themselves is seen as a neutral proposition. It seems like if you are an objective listener, if you are someone who is passive to this information, to you it will seem like this idea is fair, right? To you this idea will seem natural and universal, that well, there are very few products, there is a limited quantity of rice, naturally it should not be given away for free, and therefore it should be kept at a place where people can come and interact, and prices will be decided accordingly, according to demand and according to supply. If there are more people, if there are too many buyers, prices will increase. If there are very few buyers, prices will decrease. Again, go back to what you have studied before. All right, but important thing is, Gramsci points out that all of these concepts of the market is projected or portrayed to be neutral, when in fact this is actually a view of the intellectuals who are organic to the dominant classes, right? So while this entire market phenomenon is portrayed to be natural, portrayed to be universal, right, portrayed to be organic, one may say, in reality it is not so. In reality, it is a fabrication of the dominant classes, right? Again, go back to the example of the mall, right, where I mentioned that there is a mall owner who wants to maximize his profit, keep the shareholders happy. On the other hand, there are people working in the mall who want to maximize their salaries and their bonuses, right? So it's the same dynamic here, but the person who is the owner is in control of information, right? And that person is in a position to pass on information to you through advertisements, through everything else, through catalogs, all of that, right? Again, I keep referring to the idea of the hegemony, which I mentioned in the previous class. So that is indicated in most of the ideas of Gramsci, it seems. And in a later class, maybe I will discuss the idea of hegemony as well. All right. Now, I will discuss one more concept here for today's class. This is how class becomes a factor in intellectual activity, right? Now, what are some facts that we already know? We already know that there are intellectuals in all classes, whether it's carpentry, whether it's farming or agriculture or any other profession for that matter. And there are also intellectuals who belong to or support the dominant classes already, the capitalist class or the owner class, right? But then, how does class become a factor while intellectualizing? All right, I hope the question is clear. So now, non-mainstream intellectuals, I'm trying to answer this question that I have posed for you, right? How class becomes a factor. So non-mainstream intellectuals, for example, those who belong to the peasantry, right? Or again, within the peasantry, you can generalize working classes in much more ways. Today, I spoke about two such professions. One is carpentry, one is farming. Obviously, you have the freedom to take up other examples as well. Now, for these intellectuals, for the most experienced, or those people who exercise their intellect the most within the working classes, they will ask that how can it be that those who farm produce cannot eat the food? How is it that the world produces more than hunger desires? What happens to the rest of the food? Again, in a previous class, I had already mentioned that there is enough data to indicate that the world produces 150% more food than it requires, right? So if there are 100 people in the world, there is actually food for 150 people, but not even 70 people are fed. So what happens to all this extra food? Where does it go? Right now, the capitalist intellectual or the dominant class intellectual will tell you that in reality it's not true that there is so much food. In reality, food is very less, and the best way to distribute food is to send you to the market where you will see compete with other buyers, and then the price will be decided. But on the other end of the spectrum, the working class intellectuals will ask you what happens to the rest of the food. There was food for 150 people, so why are 30 or 40 people unfed? Why do governments destroy extra food before it is even allowed to feed the hungry? Right? These are questions coming from the other end of the spectrum, that is from the peasantry, the intellectuals of the peasantry, or the organic intellectuals of the working classes. Now, these questions, if you just read these questions, if you heard me speak of these questions, does the view that the market is a solution seem appropriate to you anymore? It probably doesn't, because these are all questions outside the pretensions of the intellectual world, created by people who are totally in support or who are totally committed to the cause of the owner class, right? So in other words, the working class intellectuals say that it is a myth that there is scarcity. In reality, there is food for 150 people, but only 70 people are being fed, and those 30 people are not getting their food. Why? They're asking why. And why is a very simple question to ask. There are more nuances to the question. There are questions, associated questions, like why do governments destroy food before it is allowed to feed the hungry? Or why do the owner class, why do they hoard food? Now, you may have heard of several peasant revolutions around the world. One of the common themes or commonalities of all these revolutions is the fact that the rich people, or the owner class to be more specific, not the rich people, the owner class were people who used to hoard, right? I think you have already heard and used the word hoarding in economics as well. So what hoarding does is, let me give you an example. So imagine that in reality there are 100 people and there is food for 150 people. Now the person, the owner who owns all this food, who has produced that food, or maybe who has used or taken the help of farmers to produce all that food, has hoarded it. He has a go down somewhere, right? And he has stored all his food there in that warehouse. All right. Now he is only allowing limited stock out of his warehouse, right? So imagine 100 people are there in society. There is enough food to feed 150 people, but at a time only food for 20 people leaves the warehouse. Where does this food go? To the market. Now the impression in society is that there is food for very few people, right? So the very fact that there is more food than is required is hidden, right? Or somehow concealed. So these are the questions coming from the intellectuals of the working class. So I will end this lecture here, right? Because there is a lot of information for you to process here. So listen to the lecture. Also, if necessary, if I was not clear enough, fall back on your lessons in economics that you have studied in classes 11 and 12 probably. These are not very difficult ideas to understand anyway. Just some of the ideas that you should be aware of is how prices are determined in a market, right? Read about the demand supply equilibrium, right? So that will tell you how prices are fixed in a market, how prices are determined in a market. Also read out about the example that we took, right? About the fact that there is, or rather about the alleged fact that there is more food in the world than there are people. And even then people go hungry, and market has a lot to contribute to that. So read up on these issues. It will obviously make it easier for you to understand Gramsci, right? So while Gramsci is talking very theoretically, all those theoretical talk is founded on economics, which is, again, to quote Marx, the base. Everything else is superstructure. Yeah, so the other thing I want you to read about is just Google or whatever search engine you use, just type base and superstructure, right? So try to understand the concept of base and superstructure. You'll probably get some images as well, which will show you, because it's an architectural metaphor that Marx came up with. So understand these things, read up on these things, and since this is a little more complicated lesson, please let me know if there's anything you haven't understood. So we'll stop here, and in the next class we'll continue again with focus on the fact, or not on the fact, but on the quote that we began today's lesson with. That is, all men are intellectuals, but all men in society do not have the function of intellectuals, right? So yeah, we'll stop here. See you in the next class.